All right, let's dive into one of the most foundational provisions in the entire Constitution, Article 6. Now, I know what you're thinking, but this isn't just some dry legal text. No, this is a story about the birth of a nation, literally forged in a moment of absolute crisis. And if you really want to understand how India defined itself right from the very beginning, you've got to understand this article.
I want you to just picture it for a moment. It's 1947. A line is drawn on a map. And just like that, overnight, millions of people find their homes, their families, their entire histories on the wrong side of a brand new border. The partition of India wasn't just a political event. It was one of the largest mass migrations in human history. And that created a massive legal problem. The framers of the new constitution had to come up with a clear, enforceable rule to answer one giant question. Who is a citizen of this new India?
And the specific answer they came up with for people migrating from what was now Pakistan into India was Article 6. It was designed with, almost surgical precision to handle this very specific situation. So how did it work? Well, it all boils down to a pretty straightforward two-part test.
To really get your head around Article 6, you just have to think of it as a checklist with two main conditions. It's a logical sequence that every single migrant had to satisfy. If you can remember these two core ideas, trust me, you've pretty much mastered the essence of the entire article. So, here they are. Step 1, you had to prove a connection to the land itself, to pre-partition, undivided India. We call that the Ancestry Condition. Simple enough. Step 2, you had to meet very specific requirements based on when and how you actually made the journey, and that's the Migration Condition. Let's break down that first one.
Now pay attention, because this is a crucial detail that a lot of people miss. When Article 6 says India, it's not talking about the map of India we know today. It's specifically referring to India as it was defined way back in the Government of India Act of 1935. So what does that mean? It means the entire subcontinent before partition. What is now India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. This was a really broad, really inclusive definition designed to make sure nobody was left out just because of these new borders.
Okay, so once you've checked the box for the Ancestry Condition, we move on to the migration part. And this is where one single date becomes the absolute pivot point for the entire article. It's a line in the sand that splits the whole rule right in two. And that date is July 19, 1948. This date wasn't just picked out of a hat. It was the exact day that the permit system for movement between India and Pakistan was officially brought in. It was an attempt to bring some kind of order to all the chaos, and in doing so, it created this formal legal dividing line between the early wave of migration and the more regulated period that came after.
So the most important thing to remember is that this date creates a fork in the road. If you came to India before that date, you went down one path to citizenship. If you came on or after it, you were sent down a completely different and much more formal path.
So let's do just that. Let's compare these two paths side by side, because the differences in what was actually required of people are really, really telling.
Okay, have a look at this table. For Path 1, these are the early migrants. It was pretty straightforward. You meet the Ancestry Condition, and you just have to be ordinarily resident in India since you got here. You do that, boom, you are automatically considered a citizen. But for Path 2, the folks who came later, there was a big extra step. You still had to meet the ancestry rule, but you also had to be formally registered as a citizen by an official before the Constitution kicked in on January 26, 1950. See the difference? It's residing versus registering.
But with any law, the words on the page are just the beginning. The real meaning, the real teeth of the law, that gets decided in the courtroom. So let's look at a couple of the landmark cases that really shaped how we understand Article 6 today.
Let's take that phrase from Path 1. Ordinarily resident. It sounds simple, right? But what does it actually mean, legally speaking? Is it enough to just be physically in the country? Well, this exact question went all the way to the Supreme Court in the famous case Kulatil Mamu versus the state of Kerala.
And the Supreme Court's ruling here set a really high bar. They said it wasn't enough to just be in India. Nope. They ruled that ordinary residence required a genuine intention to make India your permanent home. It had to be a settled, continuous presence, not just, a temporary visit or an interrupted stay.
So the key legal principle to take away from this is intent. That's the magic word. The court's interpretation made it clear that ordinary residence is about more than your physical location. It's about your state of mind, your clear intention to make India your permanent home for good.
All right, now for a more complicated situation that came up in the case of Shano Devi versus Mongol Sign. What about the people who first went to Pakistan after March 1947, which would normally disqualify them under a different article, Article 7, but then they came back to India on an official permit for resettlement? Which rule do you use for them? It's a bit of a legal puzzle.
The court solution was actually pretty elegant. They decided that if someone came back on one of these resettlement permits, they would be treated as if they fell into Path 2 of Article 6. In other words, they were legally considered a migrant who arrived after July 19, 1948. And what did that mean? It meant they had to fulfill that formal registration requirement before the Constitution started. So this case cleverly linked the rules for returning migrants right back into the main framework of Article 6.
Okay, let's pull all this together for a quick review. If you're taking notes, this is the slide. These are the absolute core must-remember takeaways for Article 6. So let's run through it. First, everything hinges on that one key date, July 19, 1948. Second, the definition of India was huge, the whole undivided subcontinent. Third, this created two paths. Path 1 for the early birds, where ordinary residence was enough, and Path 2 for the later arrivals, which required formal registration. And finally, and this is your key case citation, when you talk about ordinary residence, the case that defined the importance of intent was, of course, Kulathil Mamu. Don't forget that name.
You see, Article 6 was a brilliant solution for a totally unique and chaotic moment in history. It basically settled the question of citizenship for that entire generation right when the Constitution began. But it leaves us with this bigger, more profound question to think about. How do a nation's founding principles of belonging, principles that were forged in a crisis like that, how do they apply to new generations decades and decades later? That's a question that law and society are still grappling with today.